Welcome to the Drawbore Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Perry, a timber framer and licensed professional engineer. In this podcast, we will travel through the world in timber framing through conversations with timber framers, architects, engineers, and many other folks in the industry on their unique perspective in how shaping timbers has shaped their lives. Through these conversations, our hope is for folks of all interests, whether new to the craft in timber construction, designing, and engineering, or looking to build a home or other structure, or those who have been building timber frames their whole lives to gain new insights and perspectives through these conversations. Now, what's with the name Drawbore? What is a drawbore? Why is it used and what is it good for? That's a good question, young tenants, and follow along. You'll be sure to see. In short, it is a simple method offsetting peg holes within a timber connection to pull the connection or joint tighter. But this is our goal, stronger connections through conversations. This is the Drawbore Podcast, and I'm excited to have you along. Oh, what a treat we have here. So this episode, Ben Brungramer is going to join us for a great conversation. This will give an immense amount of information for timber framers and engineers alike. Jokes, if you know Ben, you know how this conversation is going to go, and I'm really looking forward to everybody hearing Ben and all the information that he's got to share with us.
So the podcast, I have a list of things just kind of to just jog my memory while we're talking. So podcast name, I think you were asking about the name. So I'm calling it the Drawbore Podcast. Drawbore?
Oh dear. We're not going to get out of the first paragraph without a fright on this one. That's good.
So with me is Ben Brungraber, who is Ph.D. and professional warrior, you say?
That's what it is. Worrier or warrior, one or the other, or both. Yeah.
But name of Drawbore Podcast. My first question for you would be, how do you describe a drawbore for people that don't know what it is?
That's a great question, and it's a basic one. Basically, through various means, you deliberately misalign the holes in the peg holes in the mortise and in the tenon in such a way that by driving the peg through it, you're pulling the tenon into the mortise and inducing what may or may not be actual pre-stress and a clamp action. And the pitch is made that if you do it right, you can actually use that to pull the frame together and save having to hit it with hammers and big hammers and commanders and beetles and pull it together with come-alongs that actually you can make it easier on yourself by using the peg to pull the timber together. They'll also tell you that it'll compensate for drying particularly in the mortise timber. When the mortise timber shrinks, that opens up a gap. That would open up a gap, all things being equal. But if there's pre-bending in the peg and a little pre-compression in the tenon ends and pre-compression in the side of the peg holes in the mortise, then maybe, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, I'm just saying maybe that action, that pre-bending will act to pull the tenon in as the mortise dries and will minimize the gap. I also think it's possible that you can preload to the point where you can blow the end of the tenon out by overdoing it. I also think it's a lot of work. There's two ways that I know of to do it that I've seen done. One is the sort of poor man's method, let's say. Let's say you're putting your frame together, let's say you've pulled it together really tight or hit it together really tight. The timbers are bearing, but you haven't done anything with the peg yet. You've got a hole there. Both sides of the mortise hole have been drilled. But the tenon doesn't have a peg hole in it yet, but it's down in there. You can see it through the mortise hole. So you take your drill, and what does it say? The rule of thumb was you take your drill, and people were really doing this, would use a double bit drill bit to do the mortise, and that's a real crisp hole. Mm-hmm. And then they use a single bit, which is just a little bit, I mean, we're talking not a couple hundredths, smaller, a single bit bill, and then they would point to the joint. In other words, they would not drill square to the joint. They would align it with the tenon timber and point it towards the mortise timber, and that would create a little tilted hole that you would then drive through that. You would by driving your peg through that with a little bit of taper, you would actually act as at least the far side of the hole is a little drawbore. So that was one way. The other way to do it is pre-assemble everything with a pre-drilled mortise hole, and you use a pin with a misaligned pinprick on it. So it's a dowel with a pinprick on it. And you be careful you drill it. Then you pinprick where the hole would be if you're going to put in, let's say, a 32nd or an 8th or 16th, whatever you think the appropriate number is. Dismantle everything, drill all those peg holes and all those tenons, put it back together, and then drive in a peg. And usually you have to have at least some taper, if not quite a bit of taper, to get the peg to start. So that's what it is. I'm concerned that, it's a lot more trouble than it's worth. I'm concerned it really doesn't achieve much. And I'm concerned that if you really get aggressive with it, you can, of course, blow the tenon apart. If you screw it up, the second method, you could actually inadvertently create a gap because you drilled the peg, you have tenon hole misaligned, you put it on the wrong side. So I've seen people do that too. So the question is, in my mind, is it worth it or not? And that to me is a fairly simple question. But when you throw this topic out in front of a bunch of timber framers, there's nothing simple about it. It gets to be some sort of spiritual thing about behaving appropriately and honoring past methods. And I guess I'm convinced that old timber framers did do it. I don't think all timber framers ever did it. So, but it's a big topic. It's a fun one. It's funny you'd ask that question because I'll bet, because I'm a member of both the Timber Framers Guild and the Timber Frame Engineering Council and TTRAG, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Traditional Timber Frame Research and Advisory Group or something. And those people are they're the zealots on drawboring and on daisy marks, daisy wheels, and all the different match marks they used to make on timbers. And if you would toss that bone of what is drawboring out, they'd be going on for the next 2 hours. Yeah, it's just crazy.
Well, I thought it'd be, in one way, it'd be a good name for the podcast.
Yeah.
So building strong connections through conversation in a way.
That's good.
But also, I mean, for somebody like you, it's a great kind of conversation starter as well. I mean, just any engineer, would you, what is a drawbore? And then, would you even spec a drawbore? Right.
It's a great controversial. I mean, for the cognoscenti, if you really know something about timber framing, you recognize that's kind of a controversial topic. Would I ever? I have never specified it. I've never not specified it. It's not like I quite pretend it doesn't exist, but to some extent I do. It's just sort of is it a red herring or a shaggy dog or something? There's something. It's one of those topics that is just, it's a bottomless pit, and the votes aren't all in on it. If you're using dry timber, then really it's not much need to do it.
Right. So mostly with green, dry in place.
It sort of, took root. I think it took root back in the earlier days of the birth of timber framing when people were dealing with a lot of green oak frames and they would shrink a lot and the gaps. And so here are all these, self-taught craftsmen really eager to maintain their joints. They go back and look at one of their frames 2 or 3 years later and they say, oh my. And they start looking for ways to address that. So I think that's really where it came from. They certainly didn't, have I ever seen written down some traditional, I'm sure it is written somewhere. I can't think of where it would be, but it wasn't mentioned in the text. They must have seen it, it must be passed down in lore for people. It's not like 20th century timber framers invented it. They found it somewhere codified and described.
Right.
But yeah.
So Ben, I'd like to also get into, we talked a little bit last night about your childhood, but just go from kind of soup to nuts, who you are, where you've been, what do you, in the timber frame world.
Yeah.
I mean, so we learned that you were born in Morocco.
Mom was there. I had nothing to do with it really, but yeah.
So how did that,
Dad, they were adventurous. They were a young couple just fresh out of college, and he was going to go right into graduate school and got out of college and said, boy, I'm ready not to be in school. And he was just walking down his senior year, walking down a hallway, and there's an ad on the hanging on the wall. He wanted to go to Casablanca and help build an airfield. So they had a wedding. They were going to get married in September, and they moved it up to June. So at their 50th wedding anniversary, I asked the question, why do they do that? and how did the wedding dress really fit? And was this indeed actually a shotgun wedding? And all this, and my poor mother's there, just hand over her eyes, just saying, "I can't believe he is doing this to me on my 50th wedding anniversary." They were very adventurous. They'd never been really out of Ohio and Michigan, and the next thing you know, they're just on the ground in Morocco, and along I came. They were really quite something. I mean, it's still an adventure to go to Morocco.
Yeah.
Let alone in 1951 or whatever that was. I mean, the war was not very long over. They, toured around Europe in a little convertible. And this is 6 years after World War. So, bombed out places, and it was an intense adventure for them.
Right.
And they were adventurous till their end of their days.
And how long did you stay there?
Oh, not very. I mean, I guess I had just learned how to walk, and my father booked a passage on a tramp steamer, a Danish steamer that had a Danish trawler steamer that you could lean over the side and touch the Atlantic Ocean. And Dad, who never learned how to swim, he said if I had seen the boat, I never would have booked a passage. So anyway, I had just learned how to walk. They threw me on that for 11 days. And I got back down on my hands and knees. And apparently, I was just about the filthiest thing anybody had ever seen. After 11 days of crawling around on my hands and knees on a tramp steamer. But I was also the first grandchild, so I had 4 grandparents waiting for me on the dock in Newark. Couldn't, they just passed me around. They didn't care how dirty I was. But he was a great man. I mean, I loved him for sure, and a lot of people did. He was a structural engineer, and he got his Ph.D. He was mostly aluminum. And steel, some concrete. And he taught forever. He was a professor. He's a structural engineering professor. It took him a long time because he would take a break from graduate school. So I went to his Ph.D. graduation. I was 13 or something. Then they moved, and then finally got a job and settled down just as I was leaving for college. So it was move, and then they got settled for the next 30 years after I left. I said, "Oh, great. Now you get stability." But the consequence was, it's interesting to move around that much. I recognized it as an opportunity. I moved twice in high school, and I said, well, I've done this before. If I wait around for friendships to develop, I'll be just about friends with people, and I'll be going again. And right. So one, I realized I had to get going. I had to become more outgoing than I had been. And I also recognized it as an opportunity. I said, well, I was a geek, total loser, nerd, the last school I was at, but I watched some cooler people. They weren't, cigarettes and leather jackets, but they were, cooler. And I said, well, I know that I can do it too, if I get a clean slate. So I made a conscious choice and treated it like an opportunity. And it really changed me quite a bit. It was a conscious change, and I was only, 16, and I was doing these things. So
right.
I didn't realize that until later, that I said, I know what I was, I actually had an opportunity. So when I hear people say, oh, I'm going to stay put while the kids are in school, I say, well, you can do that, or you can, treat it like an opportunity.
Right. Whereabouts did you guys move? And did you pick up like the engineering mind from your dad, or were you involved with his work as a kid? And like, how did...
Oh, he was a kid. I think he was 21 when I was born, so I don't know what he thought he was doing. And he's excited. I mean, he's a professor. He likes to explain stuff. So when you were sitting in the back seat of a car with the old man, it's bridges and buildings and wires and cables and tools, and everything's getting explained to you and pointed out to you. So yeah, and there were tools always. I was always in a shop environment, a home shop environment, working on wood, working on cars, working on, the house. I learned how to wire a house from him. He didn't know how to do it either, but he learned and, taught me as he went. So, I was raised by that kind of guy. He explained stuff and he learned stuff and he shared stuff. So,
and you're equally inquisitive and interested in all these different things too.
Well, who knows? That's genetics or what? It's funny. I got 2 sons, and one of them reminds me a lot of me, and the other one is just, I love the man, and he's 41. If I said, hey, Carl, how about a Phillips head screwdriver? I'm not sure what I'd get. He was raised in the same household, the same shop, the same parents, older brother, just wasn't interested.
Yeah. Did you have siblings too?
Yeah, I have a kid sister, and she's 5 foot tall and much more opinionated and much louder and a whole lot more fun. I mean, she's a force of nature. Yeah. I'm a lucky man.
Yep. So that Did you play like sports and all that growing up, or did you go right
I was
into...
pretty terrible at it, but actually, I'm thrilled you asked. I just actually donated a couple $100 to my high school coach, passed away, and high school football coach, and he passed away, and one of the teammates, one of the football players, started a scholarship and asked us all, and he got our name somehow or other. Knew I'd played 2 years of high school football underneath Coach Patios. So I played, but only because it was kind of funny because I moved my first 2 years of high school to upstate New York, and 1,500 people in the high school, and the team was really good. I went out for it, but I was never going to start on this team, and you would get together and it would be parents and cheerleaders and maybe 150 fans in the stands on a Saturday morning. That was it for pretty high quality football. Then I moved from there to central Pennsylvania, different world entirely. Now I'm in a high school with less than 500, and less than 500, and we are by tradition, we're in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where Bucknell University is, and I don't know when it started, but Lewisburg High School plays their high school football games in Bucknell University Stadium, which was the first reinforced concrete football stadium in the country. And I bet it holds. Well, it's a huge stadium. I mean, considering it's like 20, 30,000. And so we would play the game and outdraw Bucknell 2-1. We'd have 10, 15,000 people, and Bucknell would get, maybe 5,000. It was really funny. And it was very, very serious. Anyway, I started for them just because it was such a small school, and relative to the rest of the student body, I was big and fast enough. And I moved there, and I watched the first half of the season. My homeroom teacher said, "You've played flag football pretty well. You want to come out for the team?" I said, "It's the middle of the season." He said, "So?" I said, "Okay." So I sat in the stands one game, and I started the next week. It was just outrageous. It was wonderful, though.
So kind of flash in the pan with sports a little bit.
Yeah, that's it. After that, I'm a biker, and I'm a skier, and I used to play squash and badminton.
Did you grow up skiing and biking, or?
Yeah, we moved to the first 2 years of high school in upstate New York, and boy, you get to Schenectady, New York, and in the winter, that's it. I mean, you ski or ice ski, that's it. I mean, it's cold, and so the whole family decided we'd learn how to ski. And we did. And my sister's, I think she just quit skiing. I've skied ever since. That's like, I haven't missed a year, and I think 56 years or something. I've skied at least once. So.
Wow.
Yeah. I love it.
It's one thing that you could take with you the rest of your life.
Yeah. It's a carryover sport.
Yeah.
And there were some times when my kids were young, and I'd say, "God, this is expensive. It takes a lot of time, and I really ought to find some other hobby." And I'd get to the top of the hill, and then I'd get to the bottom of the hill, and I'd say, "Oh, God, I love this. I got to just," So my reluctance on the sport would last for the first run, a couple seasons in a row there. I'd say, this is really, not the right way for me to spend my time and money. But
right.
But then my sons, who are very active, much more active athletes than I, had very little time to spare for skiing, but I did get them. I said, "You got to be able to at least do it," because it is, as you say, a great carryover sport, and unlike, they play volleyball and swimming and wrestling. That's not a very good carryover sport. I mean, show me a 45-year-old wrestler. And lacrosse. They played a bunch of fun sports, and they both stuck with skiing. They both still ski quite a bit. So I'm glad the way it worked out.
So, with your dad as an engineer, how did you know engineering was going to be for you? Or did you stumble into it?
No, it's funny. There was a moment I was in high school, and we were supposed to learn how to use a slide rule. And so most people we had school stores, a big fancy high school. We went to a school store, and you bought a 6-inch plastic slide rule for, I suppose it would have been $8 then. But I told the old man I needed to learn how to use a slide rule. So the next thing I knew, I had a post, which is bamboo wrapped in ivory and in a leather case with a holster on it, and it came with a hardbound book. And I said, "Dad, everybody else is going to have 6-inch plastic rules, and I got this beast, But he said, those aren't slide rules. This is a slide rule." I still, of course, have the thing. As a matter of fact, I have a collection of slide rules. I got so many slide rules. I've got teaching slide rules hanging on my walls. I got 3 6-foot long slide rules you teach. I've got a drawer full of slide rules of weird kinds. Like one's a nuclear bomb calculator. It's circular, and you got two scales, and you set one on how far away is the bomb, and then how big is the bomb, and the various scales will tell you basically how many days you have left to live based on your nuclear radiation. With a bomb that big, that far away, you've got about 3 days. It's really, really grim, but hilarious, kind of dark. So I collect slide rules. Yeah. So, yeah, it was understood that my sister and I would go to college. We never really spoke about engineering. As a matter of fact, about half the colleges I applied to, I was in pre-med, and half of them were in engineering. It came easily to me. I'm embarrassed to say that I always applied myself. I never went out on weeknights. I never missed a class. Honestly, I never missed a class because my father told me that was how he did it. So I did it that way, and I said it really worked. I never fell behind. It was just the secret was to get to every class, and that way, if you realize, holy smokes, I got to start doing some more reading because I didn't understand what that professor was talking about today, and you gave me a chance to catch up instead of not realizing it for an entire week, So yeah, it came relatively easy to me, and so success in the form of decent grades, and so it felt. I don't know if easy equates with good, but it felt comfortable to me. I said, I enjoy this. I wouldn't be doing this if I weren't enjoying it. I'm convinced that that's true. I wasn't just doing it because it was easy. I was doing it because I was really enjoying it, and I continued to.
Where'd you end up going to undergrad?
Cornell University undergrad.
Okay. And so at that point, it was still a bachelor's of civil?
Yeah, interesting time. It was just, I think, 2 years after Cornell had been the last of the 5-year undergraduate degrees in engineering. It used to be like that was the norm. If you want to get an undergraduate degree in engineering, you expected to spend 5 years. As a matter of fact, when I got there, the architecture school was still a 5-year undergraduate program. Mm-hmm. But it was a losing battle. How are you going to sell a 5-year civil engineering degree at whatever the growing tuition rate was at the time, when somebody else get a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 20% less time, or was that 20% less time? So, they had given up on that, but they did maintain this thing where you didn't have to pick what kind of engineer you wanted to be for the first, I think, 2 years, unless you wanted to be a chemical engineer. Then you had to take extra you couldn't quit chemistry after a semester or two. You had to keep going with the chemistry. But I thought that I cherished that you weren't some 18-year-old kid just come out of high school and saying, I want to be a chemical engineer for the rest of my life. You got to come there for 2 full years, half of your undergraduate. You got to say, I'm interested in becoming an engineer. Maybe it'll be chemical, maybe electrical, maybe it'll be civil. Right. And I thought that was, given that I don't really think a 4-year civil engineering degree is quite professional to be. I'm sure you can learn a lot on the job, and you can, through self-study and things, learn what you really need to learn. But that's not what an undergraduate degree is to me. An undergraduate degree is really a license to go out there and find out what you really want to do and get better at it, either by coming back to graduate school, by applying yourself online courses, by studying the material, because there's simply no way to learn in 4 years everything you really ought to know to practice all the different kinds of engineering that are out there right now.
So in 5 years, was timber on your radar at that point? Or
Cornell was wonderful at structural engineering. I love my professors. They're really good. They're not just good structural engineers, but they're good teachers too. And there's a difference. And there's not, the correlation is accidental between the two. They're really fine teachers, but about I think the whole thing, I had the 2 hours of class, maybe 2 whole lectures on timber. It was mostly lumber and nails, and not even shear walls and diaphragms. Certainly no bolts, nothing, any of that. It was just lumber, 2 lectures of lumber. I will say that it was Unadilla, now it's Unilam, the biggest glue lam manufacturer in the Northeast. was so maybe, let's say, 2.5 hours away. And a guy named Bob Casaguma, who I got to know really well, came over our senior year and made a pitch to study. They would support research in, I forget what they were going to do. They were, I think, maybe glulam utility poles. And they needed some testing done. And that would have provided funding for a master's degree in structural engineering with a timber focus at Cornell. And I actually had signed up and I was going to do that. And then they handed me that Bachelor of Science degree, and that felt so good. And I said, you know what? I'm really not in the mood to go back to school next fall. And so I had not done any interviewing for jobs or anything. I just found myself on a summer day in Ithaca, New York, thinking, well, I thought I was going to go back to school in March. This fall, I was going to be right back here. And that's not what I'm going to be doing. So away, I've already fallen out of sync with my classmates in the typical path that young engineers follow, because I had made my mind up and then changed my mind.
So what did you end up doing after that?
Got in a car with two friends and drove all over the West, camping and hiking and blowing through whatever money we had left, which wasn't much. I think $600, and each of us had like $600, and we were on the road for 3 months of hiking and camping and climbed Mount Whitney and climbed Half Dome. We just had a wonderful summer, one treasured summer of my life. But then I was broke.
Yeah. And then did you go to work right after that?
Yeah. Then I actually came home and I'd pull the classic move back in with mom and dad. But by then they were living in DC. He had taken a sabbatical from Bucknell. And so I got to DC and they were building the subway, the metro, so I hustled around and got a job inspecting concrete on the Connecticut and the Farragut North subway station. So I got to work in the big time. This is big time construction, subways. I mean, number 20 bars and CAD welding them together to splice them. And it was just huge, huge stuff. And living in DC, it was pretty fun. But while I was there, just sort of getting my finances back together, I applied for other jobs and took a job with American Bridge, which is the construction division of U.S. Steel. And
okay.
They had done the Verrazano, they did the Narrows Bridge, they did the Golden Gate. They were the big time steel. They in Bethlehem. So I applied to Bethlehem, but they were getting out of it. So they offered me a job helping to finish and build a steel mill in Valparaiso, Indiana. I remember the prettiest thing about Valparaiso is the name Valparaiso, but everybody in town calls it Valpo. I said, wow, okay. I decided not to take that job. It's funny, at the end of the job interview, basically I wanted to tell them their idea was I was going to help them build this steel mill and then spend the next 7 years helping to run it. I basically said, Bethlehem Steel could liquidate all their assets now and start turning it into unmarked $20 bills and put them in paper bags, and you don't have enough of them to get me to spend basically my 20s in Valpo, Indiana, running a steel mill. I mean, I love steel mills. Don't get me wrong. I love steel mills. I worked in them, but not that one. And at the end, it was funny. I'd worked through all these. I've worked with all the younger guys, and and finally, and they're talking to me, what's life like in Valpo if you're a 22-year-old guy, And I finally end up with a plant manager. I'm sitting there with this guy, and he says, do you have any other questions? And I said, well, and I was just about to say, what's up with all these young guys smoking pipes? I've never seen anybody my age smoking a pipe before. And I looked over his shoulder, and there was a big fancy rack of pipes, and I said, oh, I get it. So if you work here, you do what the plant manager does. I said, now I'm really not taking this job. And I went with American Bridge and got to build some really big time fun stuff. Big steel. We worked in steel mills. We built the Hilton Hotel in New Orleans, 30-story Hilton. Worked on big bridges. It was just big stuff. And right away, I mean, they threw you right in. It's almost like the U.S. Army. Just here, do this.
Just throwing you to the fire.
Well, the big firms like that can afford that. They hire a bunch of kids basically, and they turn them loose. And say sink or swim, and they don't give them so much rope that they could make a mess that takes the whole company down. You don't get handed the responsibility that could get a bunch of people killed, but you do get some pretty big money decisions, and you're playing a pretty active role in some very big jobs right away. So that is one thing about working with big firms versus small firms. Small firms, they have to be a little more careful when they're probably working in smaller jobs too, but they also can't afford mistakes of the scale that a young engineer could easily do through no misdeed at all, just inexperience or any number of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that worked out really well too, to get a job with a big time operation. So I was playing minor roles, but definite roles in big time projects right away.
What was your mentorship like at those larger firms? Did you?
Yeah,
you had a lot of responsibility. But
half-assed at best. I mean, people would take me under their wing. I remember the other engineer in New Orleans had been an Army Ranger, and I mean, he was a serious man. He ended up owning and running the company as it finally shut down. Bob Luffy, wonderful man, and I guess to some extent he did take me under his wing. I could tell Bob Luffy stories for a while, but the mentorship was there. It was certainly nothing formal, but there are people watching out for you.
Mm-hmm.
They want you to succeed. They need you to succeed. They're not running a weeder operation. They're not sitting there saying, we hired 7 of them and we're going to be done with 4 of them by the end of the year, and we got to figure out which one it is. They didn't hire you if you didn't think you'd at least be able to do the job. They want you to be able to do the job. So it's I suppose it's more formalized now, but at the time, even then, it's still human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big operation, and they've seen young engineers come and go, but it's still human beings. That's one of the things I love about construction is human beings working in teams, trying to get something done that hasn't been done before. So
right. Have you taken any of that wisdom learning from a larger company to your firm now and your mentorship or?
That's a great question. We don't have anything formal. We do sort of keep an eye on each other. We do. We share jobs. We check each other's work on jobs when we're doing something we've never done before, and we call it getting a gut check. We'll run it by the other engineers, not just the senior engineers. We'll run it by, the younger engineers and say, what do you think of this? Am I really off base here?
Mm-hmm.
So, I wish mentorship were more. I got one in particular in Florida. I'm a little more, he tends to work with my projects more. So he's sort of fallen underneath my wing. But Florida, New Jersey is quite a reach, so mm-hmm. I'm not doing as well as I wish I were. But I'm also getting old too. And, I'm thinking to myself, well, none of these colleagues of mine are going to be seeing me in 4 or 5 years. So really, I don't want to just put the phone down in 5 years and say, see ya, and never pick up a phone again. I do need to transition to
mm-hmm.
let them, learn their own way and rely less on me. But and how to do that, how to back out of the various aspects of the roles you've come to play and you enjoy playing and you need to play,
mm-hmm.
How to back out of those roles is every bit as tough and complicated as getting into them.
Right.
The only thing is, there's a little different is that I see I'm trying to make a conscious effort this time. And, when I found myself taking on these roles, it was just sort of, next thing, I wasn't thinking about it. It was just next thing I knew I had bigger jobs and I had people working under my guidance and things. So
mm-hmm.
it's a little more conscious than, getting out of stuff turns out to take, I've heard it said, it's a whole lot harder to get out of things than get into things. People say, how do you get into these things, man? I said, oh, that's easy. How do you get through these things? How do you get out of these things? How do you wrap this up? How do you say no? How do you,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And engineering wise throughout the industry, do you do the same gut check with other engineers outside of your firm?
I'm sorry, what do we do with the other engineers outside our firm?
Like your gut checks? Do you do that with other engineers?
That's a great question. Some of us do. David Hortican, the late great, I love the man. David Hortican, I would see the name on my caller ID on my phone. I'd say, well, here I go. I'm about to have my brain picked without much of an anesthesia here, except for David Hortigan's grin and laugh. And he's very appreciative, but he was a very sole proprietor. I want to say that nobody could work with him, but that might have been it. That he'd been in the Army, he'd been this, he'd been that. Mm-hmm. And he was really he was a great person to work on his own. But he's a very social man. So he would do it. And that was fun. It was always fun, mm-hmm. And he was very appreciative and that I looked forward to actually his calls. Right. But that's unusual. I'd say it happens more at conferences when we get together. That at that point, if you're working on a project with somebody, you've heard about a project, or they've just given a talk, or you've just given a talk, that's when the intercorporate, if you will, exchanges happen, at least in my experience. Sadly, I mean, how would you foster that? That would be a beautiful thing to foster more of that.
Mm-hmm.
We are not terribly competitive. I mean, it's just there's simply not enough timber frame engineers out there that it's in any way a cutthroat business. All of us seem to have way more work than we can responsibly do. So, it's not like we're worried about it. I don't even know any people who are protective of their knowledge. They're pretty open. I'd say the only thing is that it's just typical professional courtesy. You don't tend to call your fellow professionals and just shoot the breeze with them because they're billable hours and they're on their own schedules. And so it's not fear of competition. It's just professional politeness is what is probably the biggest hindrance to that interplay.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Right. Kind of blurring the lines between being good friends on when you're at the conference and when you come back professionally, just kind of working on your stuff.
Right. Like, for instance, you and I mean, we blur that line. We're not colleagues as much as we're friends. We're sort of in that gray, rich zone between, colleagues that I've known long enough that we've talked about enough other stuff that wasn't professional that you become, okay, so Brian's into something. And I have the feeling maybe you've even done this once. I think you've asked me, what do you think of this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of, so it's almost like between companies, it's almost like you have to have established that friendship first, where it's really just sort of, hey, Ben, I'm doing this. Have you ever done anything like that?
Mm-hmm.
And that happens, but it's not anything organized. It's really is a pleasant offshoot of working in a friendly business. Frankly, the scum of the earth of the timber frame industry are still pretty wonderful people. So,
I think that was one of the best things that I noticed when I first got into the timber frame industry and been around the guild, of just how open everything is.
Yeah.
And just for me, it was the culture and community of just bare basics of barn raising. You can't do by yourself, and you need everybody to help you.
You know what? The alarming thing is, I mentioned in the talk, the alarming thing is one of the features of it is there's not a lot of money in it. I mean, it's decent money. I mean, people are making a decent living. They're putting the kids through school. They're paying off trucks and houses. But it's not a lot of, this is not hedge fund management. This is not law. This is a niche of structural engineering, and engineers aren't paid as much as I think they're worth. Society undervalues us in general. But, by the time you find yourself in that kind of position, and then you find yourself in a niche like timber framing or even timber engineering in general, the people that are there share your passion. They wouldn't have been there. They're not here because they heard, there's a lot of money in timber frame and timber engineering. They're here because they found their way here and they're really enjoying it. It makes for wonderful colleagues, flat out. They're there because they want to be here, not because they thought they'd get rich here.
So I guess segueing into getting into the timber world, so working in a large firm, working on bridges and in steel, what first caught your eye with timber, and how did that, how did that bug, how'd you get bit by that bug?
Yeah, well, I'd helped my father. He had this gig where he was always very practical for an engineering professor. Like, he always did consulting, and he even did a little bit of construction. And the construction he did was reinforcing steel and timber truss bridges with high tension steel rods. That was a gig that he had, he and a partner of his. And so I helped him one wild weekend where he helped install some high strength steel rods on a covered bridge. So I knew something about timber. I said, wow, this is, I recognize this is not a 2x4 held together with 16 penny nails like I had learned as an undergrad. I said, this is a 120-foot span structure that's 150 years old. This is serious, 150-foot span is still serious. So I knew enough about that. And then I was working on the New Orleans Hilton, and it was interesting, and it's a long story, but we got way far ahead of the concrete. So we're building steel 15 stories above where there's concrete, and the building is moving around. There's concrete supposed to stabilize and tie and so I was trying to keep this thing plumb, and it was dancing in the sunlight. The sun would hit it on one side and it would go the other way, and then it was a wild job. But with one thing and another, instead of using the steel decker, the corrugated decking that most high-rise steel construction now uses, that's your work surface. So it's 2 stories behind the steel. We were 15, 14 stories above the steel. So we were back to old school stuff, planks. And so we were burning through all the ironworker apprentices in the Southeast, because they would come on the job site and they'd realize what your job is to pick up those scaffold planks, bundle them up. They'll get jump 2 stories, and you got to pick them up and spread them out. You got to pick them up, send them up, spread them out. And so this is backbreaking work. And so we bought all the 2x12s in to be had in Louisiana, and couldn't find enough. So we bought a very new product, and it was like twice as much money as the 2x12s, and it was LVLs, micro lamps, whatever you want to call it, scaffold planks. So it was an LVL with a scuffed surface, so the friction was good. And these things showed up, and I knew what we had bought. I knew how much more money we had spent on them. So I was intrigued by them when they showed up. What are these things? It's basically plywood. Is like peeling a tree and putting it back together. But unlike plywood where you crossband, you put it right back the way the nature grew it. It's just now it's all in thin sheets, and the knots are all thin and spread out. And it's really a remarkable material. Anyway, so I'm watching these apprentices. These are just kids, and they're younger than I am. And they are going right when it comes time to pick them up. They would go to find an LVL plank and carry it, and they would walk past 2x12s to get to that one because it was lighter, it was stiffer, so it wouldn't flop around, which is scary when you're carrying a plank and you're 26 stories up and you're walking on iron and near the edges. You wanted a nice, reliable, and it didn't splinter them. Mm-hmm. And it was lighter, stiffer, not splintery, and it was actually kind of softer on your hands. So I was intrigued by the product. And you could tell when you walked on it, this was better than a solid. So then I realized, wow, there are some interesting things going on in timber. Engineered timbers is what it was. I recognized that there's engineered timber that's much beyond what I was led to believe as an undergraduate. And so I started looking around. So where do I learn more about this stuff? And at the time, as now, and maybe even fewer now, but at the time, there were only 2 or 3 programs in the country that offered a formal thing that said, hey, we teach you to be a timber structural engineer. One of them was Colorado State. So so I took the GREs in New Orleans, moved to another job site. Took them a while to find me. But the next thing I knew, I was off to Colorado State. So that's how I did that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then I started as a research assistant there, because I thought I was just going to go get a Ph.D. too. I'm not sure what I was thinking. I started as a research assistant, but my job was they had done all this work. What the research was, they had done all this work on establishing the composite action in a lumber, just a house framing deck, 2x10s with 5/8 inch plywood on it. Why do they behave better than if you looked at the individual components, the joists and the plywood? Why is it that the component, the assembly, is better than the components individually would lead you to believe? And so they were very interested in composite action. In other words, when you bend it, the plywood was going to be in compression on top. Mm-hmm. And they got this whole thing published, and they had it all done. And somebody finally did a little poking around with their software. They wrote this fancy software program. The idea was we were going to make more efficient floor systems because we were going to take advantage of the composite action that's there. And they realized that this model was incredibly sensitive to the gaps in the plywood. So these are tongue and groove gaps, glued or not. And you could make the model do anything you want by just tweaking. So it turned out they needed to know. They didn't have any money left. They didn't have any time left, but I was just a kid, a master's degree candidate. And they said, here, tell us how stiff it is. How stiff is the joint between 2 tongue and groove sheets? So I built this model. I built this test rig, and I had LVDTs running across it. And it was just insane. The results are just insane. I could make anything. I could make this thing do anything I wanted to. And they didn't really care. They just wanted to patch this thing up and cover this one last hole in the testing. And it made me crazy. I said, you know what? This isn't what I do. But I had a good friend who was a teaching assistant on the same program, and he hated being a teacher. But he saw what I was doing with these, foot-long specimens of gaps, and I'm squeezing the gaps. And he thought that was somehow cool. So Tom Gisman and I switched. We talked our advisors into allowing this, and I became the TA and took over teaching SMASH lab, materials lab, busting stuff and writing up lab reports and teach. I was a teaching assistant, so I was getting some time in the classroom, which is what I really wanted. So I was getting some time in the classroom and grading reports and blah, blah, blah. And so we both got our master's degree, and I switched over. All I had to do was do a design project. So I designed a prefabricated covered bridge. There's panels and arches and all this other stuff. And my great friend made a calligraphy of the cover of this design project, and then we printed it on a T-shirt. So it's, I think it was May 29th. What would this be? 1976, May 29th, 1976. And I don't have rent money for June, so I got to get this thing signed today or tomorrow, right? And I'm presenting this design project. At the end of the project, as in the presentation, I held up these T-shirts. I said, in an effort to defray the cost of getting this all printed, I've run off in a limited number of these T-shirts, which are going to be available out in the hallway after this. And I watched my committee look at each other and say, who is this guy? Get him out of here. Give him his degree. Let him go. And that's what happened. So away I went. Yeah.
So after that time, so that was getting into grad school, or that was
so that was the end. Now I had a master's degree in timber engineering, and it was a good degree. I mean, Colorado State had 2 or 3 really good professors, both in the wood science department, Joseph Bodek, who was on my committee, and a guy named Dick Van Gutkowski and Jim Goodman. They had research going on in timber. That's what they had devoted their careers to. They were on my committee. Vanderbilt wrote the book on structural analysis. So that's the advantage of going to get a master's degree in a place where there's research going on. It's not so much that there's research, but maybe that'll help you find money to get through school. Mm-hmm. But it means that there's usually more than one. It's usually more like 3 or 4. At least people share that interest. They've got that critical mass. And that means you're not just taking 1 or maybe even 2 courses on timber engineering from the same professor. You had a couple different professors. You had a couple different takes on it. They had different, specialties that they offered in it. So it was really a great environment. If you're going to get an undergraduate degree and just take a course or maybe even 2 in timber structures, that's better than that's really quite good compared to the national average, if you will. Mm-hmm. But if you wanted to get a master's degree, you really got to go find, and I don't even really know, it's Oregon State, Washington State, Clemson, some schools where basically wood products are big, the Northwest or the Southeast. Mm-hmm. For a while, it was University of Texas, and I haven't kept as good track of it as I might have. But that's my recommendation. If you're gonna get a professional degree, you got to go to a place with some inertia, some momentum behind it.
Did you get deep in the weeds with like under microscopes and that sort of stuff too?
Deep in the weeds. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things. I mean, Colorado State had a really quite renowned forest products school, whole separate school. It wasn't an engineering school at all. It was forest products. Mm-hmm. And they had labs, and I took at least 2, maybe 3 courses, and Bodek was taught over there. He's like a legend, gone now, but a legend. Joseph Bodek. He's one of the Hungarians. There's a whole school of timber engineering in Hungary that during the revolution of, 1956 or something, the Russian tanks were coming in one end of town, and this entire school with their books in their hands and a machine gun in their other took off out the other end of town. And these guys, well, you go back in those days, if you went to a conference and they were around, they would all these Hungarians would get together in the back corner and start drinking vodka and speaking Hungarian. Oh my God, they were just wild. They were wild because at a very tender age they had undergone a huge adventure together. Life-threatening adventure, and they marked the rest of their careers. Mm-hmm. They were fun. So yeah, I took a couple wood science courses in wood identification and testing wood and isolating the lignin, and I forget all the different labs that we would do. But it was a real, that's another. What you're raising is a great point. Is another way to indicate what's a school that's, if you're going to go invest 2 or 3 years of your life to get a graduate degree in timber engineering, if they have a forest products or wood science department, that's a good sign, because if you really want to understand the material, you need to understand the material if you really want to work with it. And right. And although I'm in no way capable of teaching a wood science course, I certainly have a good ground. I have a good basis in understanding the material.
So having that little bit of background definitely helps. With
it never leaves you. I've got the books. The books, some of them are just full of squiggly little numbers, all about the stiffness matrix of all the Poisson's ratios and all the different directions. Some of them are extremely technical on mechanical properties of wood. Mm-hmm. Others are, what do you need to know about the biology of wood and the chemistry of wood and the structure of wood. So,
right. Yeah. So where did you go after after graduating, getting your graduate degree?
Yeah, that's a great question. I first I because I'd love fixing covered bridges. I already done 2, so I came back. My heart broken, but that's another whole story. So I came back and again moved in with mom and dad, tried to start a covered bridge restoration business. And I gave it 2 months, 3 months, and I actually got a couple jobs out of it. Basically, I wrote a bunch of letters to people that owned and were responsible for covered bridges and say, hey, I'm a young guy and I've fixed a couple of covered bridges. I'd like to do it some more. And, I was living with mom and dad again. Well, and they helped support me while I started this business. But that went on for 3 or 4 months. I said, you know what? Okay. I gave it a shot. Time to find a job. And I found a job working for an architectural engineering firm on the 61st floor of the Empire State Building. And it was this crazy firm that did log homes and the very first of the timber framer rebirth, So it's mostly we helped form the log home council. We helped write their charter. Those were our clients, were log home builders. And then some manufactured housing. So I would do some panelized stuff and mobile stuff and modular stuff. But mostly I was there for the heavy timbers, because at least that was heavy timber. That wasn't 2x4s, 2x6s. It was logs. And then very first of the this is mid-70s, early 80s. And late 70s, early 80s. And first of the timber framers of what they call the rebirth of timber framing in North America were casting around, and every now and then they'd find themselves actually needing a stamp on their jobs. And so they'd look around and we would do it. We would work with them and analyze their frames and size their beams and get some idea of the joinery. But there I was. By now I'd fixed a couple covered bridges. I'd gotten a timber degree, master's degree in timber structures, but we weren't talking about mortises and tenons and pegs. But I knew, because I had taken apart a couple of covered bridges, I knew about mortises and tenons and pegs. If I looked around in ancient 100-year-old German stuff, I could have found it, but I wasn't doing that. We didn't have the web to do that, and didn't even frankly occur to me because I'm an American, and what do the Europeans know? So yeah, but I got a job with them, and I realized my favorite clients are the timber framers. I liked what they're building. I really like, these are frames. I mean, they transfer forces in bending and axial tension and axial compression. It's not log homes, by the way, are just terribly complicated. You think it's simple. I mean, Abe Lincoln cut these things with an axe. And what's the problem? You try and analyze a log wall. I challenge you, go tell me how that log wall actually stays there. And a lot of them don't. If it were a little simple rectangle like Abe built, they're pretty good. But that's not what people want to build. They want to build these big, long trophy houses with big, long runs of wall that are 10 feet tall and 60 feet long with no interacting partition, all this other stuff. So we're trying to get logs to do things that logs were never really good at, never intended to do. I mean, but now I want a trophy log home with a wall of glass, and oh my gosh, on and on and on. But that's what I found about timber frames. And I said, okay, that's interesting. But I was running out of money again because New York City. I mean, I had so much fun in New York City, but I called it a master charge scholarship. I'd bounce a check and they'd double my credit limit so I could afford another 3 or 4 months in New York. And finally I said, you know what, this is, I'm having too much fun. I love New York. I love New York. And I was getting broken. I could see this, the trends were not good, but I knew I'd like teaching. I'd enjoy the teaching at Colorado State. So I looked around, and sure enough, there was an opportunity to fill in for a year. Somebody at the University of Maine, and they still have a timber engineering program, was taking a year sabbatical, and they needed an instructor in timber. They needed a timber structures instructor for a 1-year gig. I said, great, sort of like graduate school, only with better money. Not good money, but better money than graduate school. So I thought that was great. And I called my parents to tell them that. And my father says, well, that's really interesting, but Bucknell needs a instructor for 1-year fellowship while we cover a sabbatical too. And you left a sports car sitting in our garage just taking up space. And this time you came and got that out of there. It's been sitting there for 5 years or whatever. I thought, okay. So I called Maine back. I said, geez, I've changed your plans. I'm going to teach at Bucknell. I thought it was going to be 1 year, and then it turned out to be 2. Met a woman, married her. At that point, now I've really enjoyed teaching for 2 years at Bucknell. I've really enjoyed it. So it's time to start thinking, okay, well, if you're going to do this teaching thing, you need a PhD. That's the deal. And so I started looking around, and along came the Exxon Fellowships, and that was an interesting gig. I said, well, if I'm going to go to graduate school, let's make it as fiscally painless as I can. And there were, 3 or 4 good schools that had something, good structures, and it was most of the Exxon Fellowships were intended to go to petroleum engineers, so Exxon's pretty cagey on how they give money away. But a couple of them were in civil engineering, not petroleum engineering. And so I applied to those schools that had them. And out of those schools that had them, Stanford, through an adventure too, but that was an adventure, had one of those fellowships, a 3-year fellowship, nice money. You had to teach one class because the idea was you're going to become a professor. And so I ended up going to Stanford. 2 boys born while we were there. Wonderful time.
So were you still working with timber framers at that point, or you moved on?
That's a great question. I had a couple clients. I had got a couple of clients, and I just saw one of them recently. He's been retired for years and years, but I visited him. I had a couple of clients, not very many, but it was only really because when I got the master's degree, it wasn't focused on timber framing. That still wasn't Morrison tenons.
Right.
That was bolts and straps and shear plates and split rings and modern as it was timber engineering. But then I get to Stanford, and I assume they've got a research proposal for me to jump in on. The gig is I'm supposed to teach surveying 1 quarter a year and then work on a research project. So I get there, I said, well, what are you guys doing? What do you got available? And it was an interesting point. I was not actually in civil engineering. I was in construction management, School of Civil Engineering. It's a department within the School of Civil Engineering, because that was where the fellowship was. So I had that. And they had just been through big things on roofer safety and job productivity. And they said, frankly, we don't actually have any research where we need a graduate student to help us on right now. I said, well, I'm here. And and I'm paying for my thing. You're paying me, and I'm justifying it by teaching surveying for you once a year. So how about if I study something that I want to study myself? They said, go for it. I can't believe this worked out. So I said, okay, how about Morrison tenon peg joints? They said, why not? So there I am. It was outrageous, frankly. So Exxon supported me while I spent that next 3 years. So I had to piece together a group of a graduate committee. And I found somebody over in Lawrence, Livermore, who Arno Schneewind, what a character he was. An interesting, shy man. He hadn't talked to a student in 12 years, probably. I found him, I said, but Arno, I've read you are the guy in fracture mechanics of wood, and I need somebody who knows something about wood on my committee, because I've got, back at Stanford, I got a bunch of, good structural engineers, 1 or 2 construction management guys, but nobody knows timber structures. I need somebody who knows something about timber. So he agreed to be on my committee. And then I had a couple, I always got along with that generation, my father's generation, they're very practically oriented professors. They had consulting businesses, they had little construction summer businesses. It wasn't just research. And that's a sad reality. And partly it's because that's who I was raised by. Part of it's the nature that I didn't understand that the nature of research was what it is, that's what pays the way. It's very, very, tends to be very, not ephemeral, but very esoteric, those research projects. By the time you're adding to human knowledge, you're getting out there in the fringes of stuff that people know anything about, or by definition. So,
right.
So I got lucky, because I was able to piece together a committee, and there isn't all that much information on Morrison tenon pegged. So I was sort of making it up as I went. It wasn't like I was standing on the shoulder of 3 generations of giants of the industry who've been testing pegged Morrison tenon joints for the last 60 years. No, I was the first person who was doing it in America. And there are a couple tests done that got written up in the 20s. I would say that the interesting thing about timber framing in America is that just as we were getting pretty scientific and Engineering News Record, and there was actually 2 different magazines those days, but people were starting to do research in structures. They were starting to do and publish research results just as timber framing mortise and tenons were falling out of behavior. They were being replaced by the railroad construction industry. They were being replaced by wrought iron straps and steel rods and things like that. So just the last, let's say the last 20 years of timber framing sort of just got caught just as the research, publication, testing labs started to get scientific about structural engineering. So there's just a few papers back from those days. And I'm talking about, from even before World War I, from the turn of the century until World War II. There was some testing done on heavy timber structures in the war effort.
Right.
But there really wasn't much of anything, and very little of it on what I was doing, traditional joinery. We call it pegged mortise and tenon, but it's really traditional joinery.
So were you a part of the guild at that point?
Wow, the guild didn't even exist until the guild's celebrating 40 years. So the guild's, do the math on that. Help me out here. That's 85,
right?
Roughly,
so this is
84, 85.
So the timber framers in New England that you loved working with, you were kind of on a parallel course, but you're going to collide.
I was finding them and doing my Ph.D. research with them just as they were starting, because I finished my dissertation in 84, 85. And that's actually the year and I knew that, I was doing my research for the people who were finding out there were other timber framers and getting it together and saying, hey, let's form a guild and have a big meeting. And so as a matter of fact, the way it came together, I finished up my PhD. I defended in front of, 6 people, including my late ex-father-in-law in California, jumped on a plane. Instead of getting my degree, I went to the first Timber Framers Guild conference in Hancock Shaker Village outside of Western Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the very first meeting. There's like 200 timber framers, and they've, everybody's excited. I mean, wow, there's other people that do timber framing. Wow, so everybody's excited. I came rolling in. I was going to a wedding too, and I rented a Lincoln Town Car, and I pulled into the parking lot like 3:00 in the morning, slept for a couple hours in the backseat of this Lincoln Town Car, got up and walked in, said hi, and they threw me on stage, and I basically did the same thing as I just presented my test results and research results, and the crowd went wild. There's the only description for it. So I just defended it to get my dissertation a week ago for 6 people who didn't know what I was talking about, basically. I mean, they did, but they didn't. And then all of a sudden, a week later, I'm doing it in front of doing the same talk in front of 200 people who are just eating it up. And I remember in the course of it, I had one of the parts of the test results, I'd done a very fine mesh, finite element analysis of a peg, getting crushed. And in the course of that, it includes the growth rings and stuff. So in the course of it, my results said something along the lines like, if you put the growth rings in, it's all free of heart center, it's not box area. I said, if you align the growth rings with the peg hole, with the axis of the tenon piece, it looks like they're about 10% stiffer if you do that. I didn't present it as fact. I said something like, that's what my analytical results say, but this is a really crude, because it was I had a really rough piece of software I didn't refine the mesh. I just ran a really fine mesh and just ran the machine all night and just had all this. I mean, it was the best I could do, but it wasn't very good. But I came back to the next meeting and everybody came up, and it turned out almost all of them had spent the ensuing year spinning their pegs as they put them in to align the grain of the pegs with the tenon piece. I said, oh my God, how many man hours went into aligning the pegs in every timber frame that was built in America this past year, because I happened to casually mention that. I said, I learned a lot. I said, well, you got to be careful when you tell these people.
And you were the guy.
I was the only one. I mean, I was saying stuff that, I was taking them seriously, more than anything. And I wasn't telling them that people haven't done one of those in 150 years. If there's a reason nobody does it anymore, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. I was excited to structural engineer who listened to them and cared what they did and had things to share with them. So they were excited.
So in 1985, did it ever hit you like you were going to be kind of the engineer that everybody looks to?
No, I was by then I think I'd even already accepted a job. I was going to teach at University of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. I was going to go to Oregon State, but then I realized, my research interests and my family are all in New England or the Mid-Atlantic states. So at the last minute, I took a job at the University of Connecticut, even though they had no timber. It was not a great fit. As a matter of fact, it only lasted, I think, a year and a half. Mm-hmm. But I made friends there. I have students there who became timber engineers, went on to become professors too, even though I was only there for a year and a half. I was surprised. There were acolytes, people like timber there, even there.
So your whole time after getting into that, you're still planning on being professor, being in the
I thought I was going to be a professor
academia.
like Dad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then I'd also realized that my dad's generation was not the future of academia, that to maintain a real, to maintain a serious presence and, climb the ladder, and, support yourself and be successful at it, you've got to maintain fleets of graduate students. You've got to go out and hustle up big grants. And I remember the first time I filed a grant at UConn, I said, I want to press ahead for the next step of testing on pegs. And I'm applying for a National Science Foundation grant. And I got to the end, I said, you know what? I can make a case that this is, $50,000 question. It's worth society, our culture, investing $50,000 in finding this answer. I'm looking at the number of people who would use the information and to what end. But by the time I added in the graduate students and the university overhead, it turns out I thought it was a $50,000 question, and it turned out the university thought it had to be a $175,000 question. So I found myself in the uncomfortable position of selling a product for a price 3 times what I thought it was worth. And I've really come to appreciate sales is without sales, nothing happens. If somebody doesn't decide to reallocate their resources to go do this instead of that, nothing happens. So you got to be able to sell. I didn't at the time, baby boomers and, sales rep was not what you wanted to be, but I recognized I was a pretty poor salesman. Now, in retrospect, I was also a kid. I said, I could have gotten in over myself and said, you know what, it's $175,000, take it or leave it. I think it's worth it. Or, I could have done it, but I found that very depressing, not to believe in the product at the price I had to charge for it. Mm-hmm. And then also I found UConn has many, many things, but it's also, it has weeder classes, because they have a pretty open book. If you get a certain SAT score and you graduate from a Connecticut high school and you're a Connecticut student, they give you a shot at going to the University of Connecticut. And, that's a great thing. That's public education at its best. But it also means that some people have to be brought into the reality that they might not just have what it takes to become, an engineer. And so we had what they called weeder classes in statics and dynamics or classics, So I found myself with students, and I'd always been a student. I could do this if I wanted to do it. And then all of my friends and associates could do it if they wanted to do it. The people who were flunking out were doing it because they had other things they cared more about. Mm-hmm. But I found myself with people that really, I wasn't going to be able to get them through this thing. I could get them through statics, but then I knew they'd get slaughtered in dynamics. And so I found myself doing more career counseling for some people. And that's fine too. In retrospect, I said that was part of the job. I just wasn't ready for it. I just didn't feel qualified to offer career counseling.
And at this point, you're how old?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm like 33, 34 at that point.
Yeah.
So so I decided, this, and I remember I cleaned off my desk and I was, kind of not enjoying academia. It just, there was no, for instance, Storrs, Connecticut is not a town. I was raised in college towns. My father's a college professor. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, I'm going to live in another college town, but that's not the University of Connecticut. Everybody goes home for the weekend. And literally Storrs, Connecticut in those days was a single stop sign with a mini mart and a gas station. Now it's come a long way from that. And it's a world-class institution, and it's really, but at that time, it really wasn't what I had in mind. Mm-hmm. So I started looking around, and it turns out one of the companies with whom I had done my Ph.D. research was growing, and they recognized they were using me as an engineer more often, and they used, they were bold. They said, we'll step up. There was nobody. There were no full-time engineers in timber framing. No company had that kind of overhead to invest in timber frame engineers. So Bensonwood working, I went to what I do. We went to burn up some panels and see flame testing on foam core panels in Buffalo. The next thing I know, I'm talking to Ted Benson about I'm going to run away from this circus and join your circus, which is what I did.
So that they were still, okay. So SIP panels were being used then, but that was most.
They were just coming into, although, SIP panels it depends on where you started. SIP panels are really interesting. And, it's certainly not, it doesn't have the majesty of the drama, the appearance, and the allure of timber framing and or timber structures, but I sure have put my stamp on. If you said you've got your stamp on 1 million square feet of SIPs, I'd say, yeah, I probably have my stamp on 1 million square feet of SIPs, which is enough to keep you awake at night, given the things that, through no fault of their own, can go wrong with a SIP. Structural insulated panel. Anyway, so I was watching that. So it's interesting, just exactly what you say. Just about the same time that timber framing was starting to get pretty serious. I mean, there were multiple companies. They were advertising. They had a guild. They were, it's getting to be a presence. I mean, it's still a tiny fraction of the housing industry, but they were getting more and more significant. Not just a couple hippies out of dirt road in New Hampshire. It was getting to be, and people were starting to invest in tools and vehicles and shops, nice big shops and stuff. So yeah, so at the same time, people were finding out, well, how are you going to insulate these things? And SIPs actually, to put a structurally insulated panel on the outside of a timber frame, so it's a skin and a structure, actually is quite modern. It's what's a guy named Hobrocken wrote a bunch of books, and basically he was talking about disentanglement. And he said a modern house in America is a magnificent thing. It's a fabulous structure. You show up with just a couple of sizes, 2x6s, 8s, 10s, a couple of thicknesses of plywood, all 4x8 sheets. You got a simple palette of things, and you got some powerful tools like guns and adhesive caulk guns, and with this very simple palette, very codified palette, you can build anything. And then you add in lumber trusses, prefabricated steel plate lumber trusses, which are a miracle on how efficient they are at enclosing space and generating a roof or a floor or even walls. Some of these things are miracles, and yet you build this structure and then you spend the next 6 weeks. So you build this structure in six days of overlapped and glued, and it's really stout, redundant. And then you spend the next 6 weeks drilling holes in it and punching, sawing through it so you can get drain pipes to run through it. And you butcher the thing, basically, so badly that usually you have to fix something before the inspector. And then it's so ugly by the time it wasn't really all that good looking to start with. And it got really ugly as you did this. And then you pack it full of insulation and make it hard to get into the wires. Then you cover it all up with drywall. Don't get me started on drywall. I hate drywall. I've dealt with a lot of it. But when you get to a timber frame, the first step of disentanglement that a timber frame is, they say, well, here's the structure and there's the envelope outside of it. So you can see the two. People worry about termites in timber frames. They say, well, if you do get termites, you can see them. You can see the piles of stuff. It's not like a stud inside a wall where that termite could be chewing away at that stud inside a wall for 10 years. And the first time you'd know is when the stud was gone. So disentangling structure and envelope was the first step. And then the next step in really taking a modern home building is a floor system that we developed at Bensonwood Working. And it's basically the structure of the second floor is the timber exposed, beautiful joist. And on top of that, it's a cavity. And it does a couple things. One, it deadens the sound between the upstairs and down, which is big. One of the dirty little secrets of timber frames is if you just put planks on joists and walk around on them, everybody knows everything, So you build that, and then you run all your ducts and your wiring and everything else in there, your plumbing. And if you do it right, you gain access. So like, if a toilet leaks upstairs, you just come in, you pop out a ceiling panel. There's the toilet just almost as easily as when you go down in your basement and look at your first floor toilets. I mean, how do I fix this thing? Or how do I run a new wire to that computer? Or all these different things. A modern house needs a lot of repairs and upgrades to your systems. And this floor system. So in other words, what was really exciting was it turns out a timber frame, through disentangling the structure and the envelope and the surfaces, turns into a much smarter house. Now, it's still more expensive than a standard house, than a stick-built house. So they're not, they're still never going to take over the development market, but they do actually offer an exciting, smart way to build a modern home, a machine to live in.
Did you find most of your time at at Benson's, was it in R&D in that sort of aspect, or?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, it was a small company. I left there were 30 of us, I mean, so when I got there were 20 maybe. And I guess there were 50 when I left. And we did what we could. And, I would certainly be involved in almost all. It was research and development. Yeah, we did, for the size of our company, we did a lot. It was a remarkable commitment to doing things differently and better, and learning about what we might do here. So that was all led by Ted. He was really, he was quite visionary, quite, completely prepared to spend incredible amounts of money, share of profits, just to make sure that we're getting better and finding new ways to do it. So remarkable. I mean, he hired me, even though nobody else. I think we had 3 licensed engineers on the crew at Bensonwood before there was another full-time engineer anywhere else in the industry. And we had 3 full-time on our crew. It was actually kind of crazy, really. And it's one of the reasons I left. I said, I'm a ceiling for all these other young engineers. Now they came to work with us. They worked underneath my tutelage, and they became licensed timber frame engineers. But for one company to have 3, or I think at one point we even had 4 licensed engineers in a company of 50 people. It was kind of nuts.
Yeah.
Magnificent, but nuts. And it couldn't go on, or I didn't think it could go on. So one of the ways to address this is I'm going to run off and start a company of my own, not a timber framing company, but an engineering company.
So I guess also, like, I want to tie this into for younger engineers as well. What sort of struggles and balances did you have for one, going off and working with Ted? It's not super volatile, but not very known.
Right. Yeah.
Industry.
That's risky. I mean, we've talked about big firms, and, in big firms, you have all that stability. Big firms don't go broke very often, don't have to lay people off very often. They've got a lot of inertia. They can afford to let you make mistakes right away. There's a lot to be said about going for a big firm. When you go to a small firm, all of a sudden, there's 1 or 2 personalities, and they play a big, it's like big fish in a small pond. And so sometimes Ted and I would struggle with that. And he's still a great friend. We got through it all, but there were times when we really saw different directions for the company. And that can happen in a small company.
Right.
Much more so than in a big company. You find yourself with a department head in a big company, you don't get along with them, one of you gets transferred sooner or later. But if you're in a small company, all you can do is grow it and grow it and grow it. And that's what we did for a while too. And that helped. I mean, that worked. We just say, okay, well, you go do that and I'll go do this. And, the company got bigger and stronger as a result. But that is a risk with a smaller company, is that you really need to get along better because you're in a smaller pond.
Yeah. And I'm sure, are you working longer hours too?
That's a good question. Yeah. Bigger companies have pretty rigorous rules on that. They're pretty, you don't pile up vacation, you take your vacation. There's, you're working there's some union crew. And so the union crew is being really careful about, when they're working overtime and not. So you've got a big presence on any job site. It's going to be people who are salaried or hourly. They're hourly. So if you're in an operation with a bunch of a large hourly contingent, then people are watching that. And they're not working extra hours, without making some accommodation for that. Whereas when you find yourself salaried in a small company, next thing you know, boy, I'm actually putting in 10 hours a day. I got 2 kids, so I'm not doing Saturdays. I was pretty careful. I only worked very rarely Saturdays, but I'd be putting in a lot of 10, 10-hour days, not 12, but 10. And when you got 2 little kids, that meant I missed 2 hours. I missed 2 hours every day, or 4 or 5 days a week. I missed 2 hours of seeing them.
Right.
And that's a price.
And not being able to work from home necessarily at that point too, right?
Right. That was not happening. You were on the road. I mean, I was on the road. I'd go on job sites a lot more than work from home. I mean, if you said I worked at Bensonwood for about 8 years, I don't know, but it was probably 10. If you said, how many days do you work from home? I'd say none, frankly, none. I actually missed. Maybe I was so sick that I stayed, but I never missed a day of work for being sick either. So yeah, it is a risk that smaller firms, you tend to then towards the end of my stay there, we became owners, and we became, small but significant owners, and shared in the profits and shared in the responsibilities, shared in the downsides, and that made it feel a little more like I'm not just being paid wages, I'm not just on salary, I'm actually got skin in the game, and it made it a little easier to say, well, I'm just going to, work. If this has to happen, I got to make this call. I got to make these calculations. I got to do this estimate. It just has to happen. I'll be another 20 minutes later for dinner. That's just it.
Yeah.
That happens in small companies. You're right. It doesn't happen in big companies nearly as much. People don't have that same sense of loyalty to a big company. It's not like I used to tell the crew, I said, I know all your kids' names, so, and I know who's going to get hungry if I don't sell a couple more jobs in here for next month, so, and I know their names, the hungry little kids. I said, it was a lot of pressure, and you took it seriously, and you
were on more of like the sales side of it.
That's an interesting way as it came to it, because that's where I really learned about sales are important. They're crucial. I mean, until somebody sells something, nothing's happening. I tell people, if you're going to bring one tool to the job, bring the money. It's the tool. I sold our commercial jobs. I sold our public jobs. I sold, not many houses. I didn't do many of the houses. A couple of the odd houses that some our other people couldn't get along with. I was like the desk of last resort. If Ben can't get along with him, nobody can get along with him. So I had a couple of I remember there was one, and he really was a pain. And part of the problem was just getting hold of each other. We'd play phone tag for 3 days. By the time we finally got a hold of each other, we'd have forgotten who was originally mad and what were they mad about. We couldn't even remember, And that had been going on with all of our design team before he showed up on my desk. So I was just about to fire the guy, and along came email. And he and I started talking by email. For one, I didn't have to listen to his high-pitched, whiny voice. And he would send me this email. It would make me cranky. And I'd sit there and I'd read it, and I'd fire off a suitable retort, but I wouldn't hit send. And I'd go and mess around in the shop or do something. An hour later, I'd come back and I'd look at these are old Apple screens. I mean, tiny, beat up old computer screens. I'd read my response. I said, you know what? He actually has a point. He's got a miserable way of putting it, but I would rewrite my email, and as a consequence, it smoothed right down. It was just like we talked every now and then. I'd have to write 2 versions of the email because he had cranked me up again, but it quieted down. So the job ended up. I finally, he and I talked again, and I said, hey, there's a spot in your frame, sort of in this dramatic 2-story space with a view out of the Gulf. You live right on the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a 2-story space, and it's right in the great room. And we do need to tie these 2 posts together, but that's all it has to do. Do you have anything special you'd like have in mind for that timber? And he said, make it bold and artistic. That's what he says to me. I said, bold and artistic. Okay, I'll show him. So a guy in the company who lived on the road, and I said, hey, Kurt, you got any interesting trees on your property you're taking down? I said, well, there's this wild Y-shaped looking thing that I need to take it sort of, it's dying anyway. So I said, take it down and bring it in here, will you? So he takes it down, we bring it in here, and we hung this Y on its side over this thing and peeled it and connected in 3 spots and scribed it into the thing. I didn't tell this guy what was coming. He told me he wanted bold and artistic, and I said, well, I'll just show him, all right? But I started getting nervous. I said, well, I don't know this guy all that well. What if he said, what are you doing in my gray room with that strange idea? And it turned out it went great. The guy loved it. And sadly, Wilma came along, I bet 6 years later, and pounded the thing right into sawdust. It got washed away in Wilma. But for the 6 years it stood there, it was a bold and artistic timber. That's what he asked for, and that's what he got. And then, okay, you asked for it. Yeah.
You brought up technology. Right now we're recording a podcast, which didn't exist at that point.
Right.
Just,
Pod what? That's what I would have said.
What would it have been at that point? But throughout the years, you've seen a drastic change in technology. You mentioned slide rules earlier, and slide rules.
Oh, yeah. I made it through undergrad on a I remember I got all the way through senior year on a slide rule. And that spring of my senior year, one of the things we did, we all went and visited freshman engineers in the dorm just to, say hi and not be a mentor, but make sure they're okay and had an idea what to expect and things like that. And every single one of them had a calculator. I said, wow, there it goes. Just like that. I'm the last one out of here. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I've seen a lot of changes.
What do you think has been better or worse with some of these changes, like finite element modeling and bin modeling? And
That's interesting. Every single school I went to, all three of them, I ended up writing the computer program to analyze it. As an undergraduate, I had decks of IBM cards, and we, formed the stiffness matrix and inverted it and turned it into results of deflections, and took the deflection and turned that into bending shear. It was just incredibly hard thing to do. It's just a nightmare of a thing to do. But compared to the commercial software that was out there anyway, it was actually as good as anything you could get. We were writing stuff that was as good as structural engineering analysis tools as there were. So that time I wrote it for that. The second time I get at Colorado State, I had this Professor Vanderbilt who wrote the book on computer matrix analysis of structures. And it really was quite a book. He really was quite a guy. But part of that course was you wrote another program to, starting with stiffness matrix and da-da-da-da-da. So the second time I'd done it. So then I get to Stanford. I said, oh dear. And part of what I was doing was modeling timber frames with the connections as springs, axial, rotational, and shear springs. And my connection testing was establishing what's a reasonable spring constant for a mortise 10 peg joint. And then I had to plug that all in there. Well, I looked around and said, I can't find a commercial software that includes springs for connection. So I had to write it again. I'm sitting there saying, this is the third time I've written a basic computer program, assemble a stiffness. This stiffness matrix is really complicated because the connections are elements too, and they're springs. And I have to have this case to put in for the spring. So the upshot of it was, by the time I got to out as a professional engineer, I said, I've written the program to do this thing 3 times. And I've had it in the course of writing this thing, you learn to look for things that are wrong. And you debug your program by saying that joint, that can't be that if that's over there doing that. And this sure can't be this if it's turned to the axial around the corner and it's that. Something's going wrong, you debug it. And you spend time on it. Now the programs are so fabulous. I mean, you just take a 3D model and you don't even have to key in. I used to have to key in the coordinates, and that was half the work, was figuring out X, Y, Z components. Where are they? Where are these nodes? Now that's all animated. And then the output is, that's why I was looking at those results yesterday. I said, there's just no excuse for literally pages of numbers. That's craziness. Because the outputs are so visceral and you look at them, but I still am able, unlike some of my younger colleagues who are very good with running their software, they're fabulous. No, I can't come close to touching them. I don't do it. I don't even maintain some of the licenses they maintain. And they do it, but I'll look at it still and say, something's wrong. Did you model that as a pin or did you model that as fixed? And they'll look and say, oh, you're right. Or that timber should be able to slide past that timber and you should see it. Because I've looked at so many moment diagrams and so many shear diagrams, so many deflected shape diagrams that I see them in ways that no, you can't until you've looked at them for years. And so that's been really interesting to me. Those tools are fabulous.
Would you recommend then for a younger engineer to still do free body diagrams, even if they're using the model, and break it down into simple form? Or what would you?
That's a great question. If you'd asked me that question anytime up until 5 years ago, I would have said, absolutely. Free body diagrams are the way to understand connections. There's no way you can't take a computer printout of a connection and know what forces you're trying to transfer from which member to which other member without free body diagrams. And to some extent, I think that's still true. But it's just one way to do it. I think, so the tools now have gotten to be so good where you're actually taking the physical model. Like I can see the tenon and the peg in some of these models, and I can put the forces on there. Some of these outputs are doing that. There's another way to do it, almost, maybe, and I don't do enough of it yet to see that is it as good as actually doing a quick free, because I love free body diagrams. I always have. I dream in free body diagrams. But is it the only way to do it? I don't think so anymore. Up until 5 years ago, I said, yeah, if you can't do if you can't do a free body diagram, that should be alarms. If I say to you, free body diagram, it's not like Maxwell diagrams and some of the obsolete methods of moment distribution. Some of the hand methods I had to learn about doing structural analysis without a computer, those are legitimately obsolete. They were interesting. Took years, and they were miracles when they first got here, and people used them for 30 years. It was the state of the art. Those can die, but free body diagrams are so basic, and a free body diagram is just do you understand what's going on inside that structure or not? Can you cut a piece out of it and imagine and draw for me what forces are being applied? If you can't do that, then you don't really understand the structure. Right. So as an indicator, as a tool for analysis, and for it's not so much analysis, although you can analyze stuff with free body diagrams. Yeah, that's what method of joints is on a truss analysis. If you still did method of joints. If you can use it as a tool for analysis, but it's the exercise, even just to draw it, and then and the components of the connections that come together. Is force going from this member to this member through that member, or is it taking another path? And the free body diagrams can many times, they're a potent tool, and they're a real clear indication of, do you actually understand what's going on inside this structure?
Right, and as structures get even more complicated and less redundant, that becomes even more key too.
Yeah, right. I think that's true. I think unlike these other analytical tools that I've mentioned that really legitimately are, they're obsolete, and they're, and people say do a quick hand check with a method of joints on, do a quick hand analysis of a truss that the computer said this about. Maybe I would do a quick method of joints on it, but that's really a free body diagram. It's not a bad tool. Quick check, say, is that really that much tension in that cord way out there in the middle of nowhere? Just you cut one free body diagram, write one equation, and you can tell me how big that force must be. Right. If you draw the free body diagram. So it's potent. It's a potent tool, and it deserves to be kept around. Right.
So there's still some importance.
I think so. And if you can't use them, then that's a bigger indicator to me. I'm afraid you just don't really understand how stresses and forces flow between objects,
right,
or pieces of objects.
There's one thing that's like, through your time and what you've seen, having to build and break a lot of these tools, you gain a lot more insight. I know what this tool lacks because of all the things that you've had to do.
It's safe to say I've seen behind the curtain on structural analysis, and I thoroughly admire the modern tools, and because done right, but it's still capable. If results are only as good as your model, and that's what I'm looking for, is how did you model that? Right. What did you think? Was that a fixed base there, or did you fix at the top? And we were talking about yesterday with that one analysis. Why is there a moment up there at the top unless you think it's fixed? And why do you think it's fixed?
That's probably one of the hardest things also to then teach. And I guess that this would tie back into the mentorship aspect too of, now that we're not doing so much hand calcs and behind the curtain so much, but now you have to kind of build this model. At what point is a model too cumbersome than just doing hand calcs?
Models that concern me, some of these models are optimizers, and they'll actually take a position. They'll say, hey, listen, if you want to minimize the number of pounds of steel in this floor system, here are the sizes, and they'll go and run through a bunch of permutations. This is a miracle, but it's also, wow, at this point, if you're using that, then you're just, an operator. You're not an engineer. You're operating a piece of software, which is, maybe that's okay, but that is what you are. Right. And it just feels like, if this is all based on a model that was wrong, then you just put garbage in and got gospel out.
Right.
And that alarms me that people could do that. If you're not capable of looking at the moment diagrams or the bending stress diagrams or something that came out as a result of your model, and looking for things that are wrong, jumps. Why would it jump there? Right. Looking for curves that are discontinuous. Discontinuities are weird. Where did that moment go? It went around the corner somewhere, maybe some other stick somewhere. Why is it even there? You must have fixed something that you didn't mean to fix, So you just, and I don't know how to do that I don't really know how to teach that. Other than mentors can help. You go do analysis, and come and we'll sit over the deflected shape diagram. We'll sit over the moment bending stress diagrams. We'll look for things that, and I'll sit over your shoulder and say, this is what I see when I look there. I want to know, why is that doing that? I don't, that I'm having trouble. But on the other hand, the capacity, because what it could do, I love redundant structures. They keep engineers asleep at night. In fact, because it turns out I tell people I'd see timber framers, they'd be discussing, well, does the load go down here or there? I said, the fact that we're having this discussion is relieving to me. It means that the structure has two different ways to do it, which means it's hard to tell which one it is, as a function of relative stiffness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's really interesting. And boy, that's a potent way to use these tools. So where is the load really going? If I change this, where does the load go? And so you're just playing these games to see where the load paths really are. Is this acting as the question I was asking yesterday? Is that a bottom chord of a truss? Is that a beam, or is that an arch?
Mm-hmm.
Now I look at it and say, well, the only way it'd be an arch if there's something there to resist the thrust, and that's not there. And the only way it could be a tension cord of a truss is if it's firmly connected to the compression cords of the truss, and that's not there. So by definition, the only thing that's left is the beam. But that's, how do you think like that? If the first thing you've done with a structure is pumped it into an exotic computer analysis program, piece of software, that's pretty unreasonable expectation that somebody would have that kind of take on it right away. I mean, there's just no replacing experience. And experience with somebody watching you is better than experience on your own.
Part of that experience, would you recommend then, especially getting into the timber world? Because, I mean, we could pump things into models, but not quite know what connections we would need. It seemed like connections have been the biggest.
Connections are really the big, they say structure is a bunch of connections held together by members. The members are nothing compared to the connections. If you want to kill people, have a connection fail.
Right.
If you want to get sued, have a floor bounce or something. Right. But
so would you recommend then at like students that graduate in engineering, whether it's grad, undergrad, or whatever, spend time out in the field raising and constructing?
You certainly, we've already talked about 4-year undergraduate and with it, but even with a, I don't think really I think one of the definitions of a professional engineer is that a professional engineer, that they are at least qualified to work on their own, largely on their own, without direct oversight on a regular basis. That's one measure of them. And as a matter of fact, we as a company, you're not allowed to do that. For us to have a young engineer working underneath us, they have to be under the direct supervision of one of our licensed engineers. They're not legally or ethically allowed to be working from home remotely. And I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. I think that there's just so much to be learned. The stuff we've been discussing about, how to use these tools, how do you interpret these results? There's just so much to be learned working with somebody else and underneath the eye of somebody else. To pick your field, I think, to work in your field, you ought to have a master's degree before you even consider working on your own, or even in a small company. You really ought to have a license, which means your education plus, generally speaking, that means enough education to qualify, and that's usually only 4 years, but enough education to qualify, and then 5 years of experience working with another engineer. Right. And I think that's all very good. Right. And it all stands up to scrutiny that you really ought to have a license before you work alone, or anything approximating alone, like being the only engineer in a company is like working alone.
Right. So kind of wrapping up here. We've been talking for a little bit.
Yeah, I've been talking a while. And I'm supposed to give a talk tonight too. I don't need to start the evening horse.
But as far as just kind of wrapping up thoughts, where do you see the timber industry going now, and where would you maybe like to see it?
You know what? You don't have to look very far. I think if you look at Europe, you're looking at where we're going. Europe, and we'll talk about it a bit. There's a fascinating thing, and what really I think the fascinating defining event in American timber structures is World War II. In that, at the end of World War II, we had steel and concrete production up to levels that were 2-3 times what it had been before the war, and nothing much had been bombed. So it wasn't like we needed to go build a bunch of bridges in a real big hurry, a bunch of high-rise buildings in a big hurry. So the steel and concrete settled in, and they did what they had to do, but they worked in the big stuff. And they might have been more tempted to move down into the smaller markets, and some of them did. Some of them did start saying, well, let's go do manufactured housing. On the other hand, at the end of the war, the GIs came home and they needed houses, and in the timber industry had expanded a little bit, so they were fine. We'll build houses, and that's what we did in America. Timber moved into houses, and steel and concrete stayed in public, commercial, industrial applications. On the other hand, in Europe, at the end of the war, the steel mills are all bombed. They're gone. And all the long bridges are gone. All the tall steel buildings, if there were many. There weren't, but we were starting to build them in Europe. Even it got started in America. Chicago and New York had taller buildings than Berlin did, but they wanted to build taller buildings. So all the steel mills. So in Berlin or in Europe, they took what steel went. As soon as it got back online, they needed to use it to build bridges and high-rise buildings and big structures. And on the other hand, you can bomb a forest for quite a while before it's like non-productive. And a sawmill, as intensive as they are pretty cheap compared to a steel mill. So we weren't bombing sawmills. We weren't bombing forests. They got beat up. They got burned. Wasn't a great time to be a sawmill, but they come back pretty quickly. So in Europe, the timber industry bounced back faster than the steel and concrete industry did. And so the timber in Europe moved into the middle buildings. They were doing commercial buildings. They were doing gymnasiums. They were doing swimming pool enclosures. They were doing industrial mills. They were building in things where in America that was it. So as a consequence, if you're going to build those sorts of things, you need to have more engineering than if you're going to build a house. And as a consequence, European engineering in timber was generations ahead of American. And when I started this industry and started looking around, I said, wow, the Europeans know and use a lot more sophisticated stuff than we do. And it's just, that's as simple as explanation as that. So I think, so some of the models will be, they're building stuff. They've been building high rises out of timber. They've been building school gymnasiums out of timber. They've been building buildings out of timber. All I have to do, you're going to go find inspiration, go look in Europe. There's lots of them that are, 30, 40, 10 years old. And they've also developed tools, both software and hardware, and infrastructures. So the sawmills in Europe are just extraordinary, and the CNC machines that cut timbers are extraordinary. And they've set up systems where they'll be every 75 miles you'll come to another CNC timber cutting machine, and then all the little firms around there deal with the clients, figure out how to do it. Then they send in their orders. They even send the timbers in. The CNC machine, centrally located, does all those timbers. Then they come back out to the small satellite shops, who then put them up and finish them and complete the building. So, that's an infrastructure model that I think we're heading toward. I mean, it's a logical model if you're going to spread up into the market.
Right. And closing out here, if you could think of one of your favorite projects that you worked on or life experience in the field, what?
I've had so many. That's a great question. Some of them are tied into clients I've had. I built 3 houses for one magnificent guy named Jack Morway. I like the commercial jobs because you can go see them. You don't have to go knock on the door and reintroduce myself. So I've always enjoyed the public jobs, and there's some great ones out there. There's a dodecahedron. That's 8. I think that's 18-sided. There's an 18-sided 2-tiered cake at the bottom of Stein's Run at Sugarbush Mountain in Vermont. Fabulous, and got timbers where it's all glue lamb, ripped glue lamb, and it's just every little detail. And it's very repetitive, but every little detail we thought it out carefully because we wanted to make money at this. It was a design build job, and it just came out beautifully. And we made things like spots where 3 timbers form a triangle in space, and then another timber goes through that triangle. I mean, that always amuses me no end. There's another one. There's an octagon at the base of a ski lift at Mount Sunapee in New Hampshire, and these are pretty special jobs. And all I had to do was go skiing and walk in and have lunch, or even a beer after both of them. I can have a beer in them. These are my some of my favorites. There's some big commercial buildings like the Vermont building in Brattleboro. It's a big building with 72-foot long solid sawn timbers in it, and 150-foot long walls we assembled and raised with 2 cranes as a unit. It was early on, right after I got to Bensonwood Woodworking, so we were in way deeper than anything. We went from doing a house to this. It was huge timbers and big things. So there's some that were and turning points, and then there's one up in Nova Scotia, the first really cool house built there since Alexander Graham Bell built one there in 1890 or something. And it's all splines. It went together. It was such a complex building that we designed that it had to go together with splines. It pushed the science or the craft of splines into another world. It was a quantum leap of, it was one of those things. It's just sort of like, where did that come from? This doesn't look like anything we've done in the past. And just when you're sitting there thinking, wow, we're doing something that nobody's ever done before, go dig up some old references. It turned out some Korean carpenter did one 1,600 years ago. I said, oh, great. Guy's been dead 1,500 years, and we're just catching up with him. Oh, great. Anyway, there are some that I remember very, very fondly that I would, that changed my life, changed my career.
That's awesome. I think any other engineer just having something like that and just continue your passion and just keep driving you forward too.
Yeah.
If you could think of 3 other people for me to talk to, who would you maybe?
Oh, that's good. Certainly, if somebody needs to talk to Ted Benson, Jack Sobun, Dennis Markham. Dennis Markham was shop steward at Bensonwood. He's a very well-spoken man. He was well on his way to being a Jesuit priest and became a timber framer instead, met a woman. And Jack Sobun, of course, has taken a different path, but he's been very dedicated and he's a scholar of it. He's a scholarly man. Jan Lewandowski, if you're talking to people who, have rebuilt significant timber structures and know a lot, if you're looking for a scientific, historic, and he's a very eloquent man. He also, it would have, he doesn't want to leave upstate Vermont anymore much. He's about to turn 80, I think. Vital man, but he's got other things that are more pressing right now. So, but these are some of the big time personalities and characters who have changed the way things are done and have cared about it for a long time.
Been part of the founding too.
Right? Yeah, they were all there for the first meeting, and they've been doing it ever since. Dennis just retired. I think Ted said that he's not going to speak much, but he might be interested in a podcast because it's really, unlike the podcast, what this offers that, so he gives a talk in Washington State, and there must have been 60 of us or 70 of us in that room. Nobody goes back there and gets that out and says, "What did Ted Benson say on that day?" And that. It was good stuff. It was good material. I listened to it carefully, but I'm not going to play it again. Because there's a difference between replaying a talk that was given and a podcast, it seems to me. So these are podcasts, at least present the possibility of longer lasting. Like this is, and he's written at least 3 books that I can think of. So he's into legacy, leaving legacy and, leaving something behind with his name on it, but also something, not just because it's his name on it, but because it's something to help people that follow us, and that's important to him. It's important to Dennis, important to Jack. Jack's written a book, at least a book or 2.
And for folks also, just kind of learning about your growth, what would 3 books be that you would recommend?
What were the 3 books?
Yeah.
I love this. I have this book. It's a Russian book from 1956. And it's called Wooden Structures or something. It's just a compendium of articles. And I'll tell you what, this is a little book, but if my office is on fire and I'm out the door, I'm grabbing it. And it's just spectacular because it'll tell you how to sharpen a saw. It'll tell you how to build a 400-foot tall wooden tower. It'll talk about shear keys, laminating timbers together. It talks about something called a Derivigian beam, which is just one of the coolest objects that ever was. I've never seen it anywhere except in this book. I've actually seen pictures of them, but you see it described how to build one in this book. The illustration about how do you build one of these things. It talked about peg capacity. This book unbelievably reaches into the dim past. I think it talks about log wall corners, and it goes right up into 400-foot tall communication towers. It's an extraordinary book, and I forget who is the editor. It's just a bunch of people put together this. And Lamella Vaults, a passion of mine, Lamella Vaults, talks about how to build these things and how to analyze them. Then there's another one. There was a guy named Julius Natterer, who was a genius. He a breathtaking bear of a man, just an incredible speaker, and charisma just dripping off him. And he designed and built and sold some of the most outrageous structures of the last 40 or 50 years. And he was a co-author of there's at least 2 books in the series, and they're big format McGraw-Hill books. And I don't forget, it's Design and Construction and Timber or some handbook or something. It's a pretty lame book, but it's packed with descriptions of actual projects, details, sizes, written descriptions, drawings, one after another, 2 on a sheet, facing each other, 4 sheets, and then entire chapters about how to prefabricate and multiple this, multiple that. I mean, it's just extraordinary books.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so those are the 2 that I use for knowledge and inspiration. And then the one I use is that I took timber structures from, and it was a guy named Robert Hoyle. And it was so, and they did a second edition of it, but it's certainly not LRFD. And nobody's published it, I bet, 15 years. But to this day, that represents the clearest, topic by topic by topic illustration and description of timber structures.
Mm-hmm.
On all, my talk I'm giving tonight includes an extract from that book. This breathtaking, still free body diagrams to die for. I mean, and so those are my big 3. And I think I've got multiple copies of each just in case. When I see a copy of any of those, I grab them because not one of them's in print.
Right.
And so that's sort of, it tells you a little bit about the nature of timber engineering. Is that a simple question like, what's the best textbook? People used to ask me, and I never had a good answer. I told them what I used and what I liked, but they couldn't get them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll ask people now, what do you use for textbook? And most of them say, well, you do. They actually use the code. I said, well, that's certainly correct. It's kind of uninspiring, but it leaves you. It's one of the things about timber structures that I actually like is that it's not terribly codified, and it isn't terribly overwhelmed with powerful tools like optimization, like the steel industry has. Frame, some of that stuff's automated almost.
Right.
And there is an awful lot of him. If you know the code, the timber code versus a concrete or a steel code is so much more flexible. So in the lack of a reasonable textbook, it's a rational thing to do, and much more so than to use a steel code as your textbook could be insane. The ACI code, what would you even do with that? I mean, it'd be hard to even get up a lecture on that beast.
Mm-hmm.
But the code, the timber code is actually, I think, is a beautiful thing because it does it gives the designers and engineers room to move.
Right.
Much more though than with steel or concrete.
Yeah. So it sounds like with more resources, we could get more into the weeds, but also, graduate level.
Yeah.
Where you kind of can do that a little bit more.
Right. So for an undergraduate, I think it's perfect. Get them familiar with the code. What's wrong with that? That's never wrong.
Right.
So, it says there isn't any more reasonable book available than it's a rational thing to do. And I think that is what most people do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Ben, I appreciate your time.
Always fun, Brian.
This time in the talk, and I appreciate your mentorship.
Well, I hope it didn't turn out to be just a bunch of old stories by Ben. So I'd like to think it can help somebody somewhere in some way.
Yeah, I appreciate it greatly. Yeah. And like I said, in your mentorship.
Well, thanks for getting me on board.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, real treat. A real treat.
Thank you for watching another episode of the Drawbore Podcast. We loved having you. If you're on YouTube or any other social media, you know what to do. But also, if you're looking for some more info and behind the scenes, consider joining us on Drawbore Podcast Patreon. We'd love your support.